We are going to begin shortly. I know the conversations are good. Well, good evening. I am Mary Marshall, a meteorologist at WSA 9 in Washington, D.C., and it is my pleasure to join you all again for the second year as the Master of Ceremony for this distinguished lecture series. Really excited to be here. I feel like I am in the company of the very best. Please join me right now in welcoming Craig Long, President of the Judge A.W. Center Board of Directors.
Thank you, Mary. Welcome, everyone. I have the honor of having probably the shortest time up here, which I'm happy for, but I just want to welcome you all and thank you all for coming and supporting us again in our 4th annual lecture series. As you know, this is the time we have once a year where we can interact with donors, supporters, friends, and groups like that have committed and done significant things for the community, for individuals in underrepresented situations. So we certainly appreciate you being here. We hope you enjoy the night. And if I could have you direct your attention to the screens to my left and to the right, because we have some words from Dean Pine of University of Maryland College Park.
I'm Darrell Pines, president of the University of Maryland. The Judge Alexander Williams Jr. Center for Education, Justice, and Ethics at the University of Maryland and the Department of African American Studies lead an important mission: the development of solutions and a forum for discussing the prevailing issues facing underserved and disadvantaged communities is critically important in today's troubled times. Each year, this lecture focuses on one of the center's 3 pillars: education, justice, and ethics. The program will highlight innovative initiatives aimed at addressing gun violence, health disparities, and injustices in the criminal legal system. These important efforts align with the Fearlessly Forward strategic plan, such as the Judge A.W. Center's recent announcement of an expansion to the Justice Thurgood Marshall Center at Public School 103 in West Baltimore. As part of this expansion, the Baltimore Initiative will bring a blend of applied academic research, health advocacy, intervention programming, and ethics training to West Baltimore. Please join me in congratulating all of this year's honorees in supporting their important work. These signature intervention programs are just a few examples of how applied academics research is addressing the grand challenges of our time. This work is being leveraged to create space for important public discourse that enriches the quality of the intellectual life at the university and throughout the state. Taken together with the proactive investments in bringing together sustainable community partnerships, the Judge A.W. Center truly embodies what it means to be terrapin strong in the face of adversity. Next year marks the 10-year anniversary of the center, and we look fearlessly forward
Judge Alexander Williams Center. I want to first start with a very special recognition for our top sponsors, which take our breath away because it's their way of saying thank you to Judge Williams for his legacy. And I shouldn't say legacy, you're here. It's all the good things that you're doing now, the thought leader, for Kim and Michael Pastor, our organizers, Bruce Mariana. Bruce, you're here? Yes, Bruce, thank you so much for your gift. And he is joined by the Honorable and Mrs. Francis Kelly Jr., the Jim and Patty Rouse Charitable Foundation, Geico, and Google. And we'll continue further. I hope that you will turn over each of the pages and look at the individuals who've invested. I have the honor of asking you to think more about your investment in a better Maryland and a better America by contributing to the center. I was thinking before I stepped up, if we give more to Target and Target than we give to the investment of education and equity, then we should not complain. Tonight I'm asking you to think very deeply about where you're giving your gift and look at some of the efforts that we're doing tonight and unapologetically asking you to invest in the work of the center. The return, it's all about futures, a better and brighter future for children, for leaders, and most importantly for you. So on behalf of the center, I hope that if you haven't thought about writing a check or encouraging your employer, that you will reach out and do that. And on behalf of the judge, thank you so much. So now, Reverend Hathaway, I know as a minister, you're used to asking, making the ask, and the people say amen and they go on. And they probably say, thank you, Reverend, for moving forward. So they're going to say, thank you, Karen, for moving forward. Okay, that's my cue. And I know the judge said, Karen, move forward. Speaking of moving forward, if you've ever lost someone, whether it is a treasured pet, companion, mother, father, you know that the world changes. For Annette March Greer and her family, the loss of their beloved mother, Roberta, was not an end, but it became a beginning. And not only a beginning for the citizens of Maryland and Baltimore, they became the very first bereavement center in the United States focused on African American children. Unapologetically, I nominated Annette because I've seen her great work in helping to dry the eyes of adults, of children, and helping people who have lost hope find it again. I hope that you will not only give her all the applause and the March family that they deserve, but I hope you will visit the website. And the next time someone loses someone and you don't know what to say, I want you to say Roberta's house. And I want you to think about when you hear Baltimore and you hear gun violence, think about solutions and care, Roberta's house. I want you to join me as I welcome to the stage the Honorable, no, she's not a judge, but she's honorable in all the work she's done and most ethical, Annette March Greer, to accept this award for her work and the work of the entire family. Annette, please come forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, board members, and everyone who is present here today. This is a calling. This is a calling to my life, to the work, to much is given, much is expected. And I have come from a wholesome family that has served thousands of people in their time of bereavement. And addressing grief and trauma in our communities is something that we have not talked about or addressed for centuries. And it has become a part of our illness, the inequities of our society, and the trauma that leads to more trauma. And so to do this work, I'm honored. I'm privileged. It is purposeful, it is meaningful. Thank you for this recognition. Thank you for acknowledging the work that is being done. Karen and the board and Judge Alexander Williams and all that you're doing to address the health inequities in our communities. Thank you so much.
I am going to introduce the video for the center and a video that profiles more of Annette's work, so please enjoy. Thank you.
We're proud to recognize Roberta's House, a family grief support center, and the incredible work being led by Miss Annette March Greer. Roberta's House is a unique space in which children who are dealing with adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are able to receive the care and mental health support they need to process their emotions, memories, and feelings.
My name is Annette March Greer. I am the co-founder and president of Roberta's House Family Grief Support Center. We are located in Baltimore, Maryland, and in Prince George's County. Roberta's House Family Grief Support Center provides trauma-informed care, grief support programs, and education to children and families who've experienced the death of someone close. The greatest reward for me personally in doing this work is seeing lives transformed. When they come to Roberta's House, people are grief-stricken. They're in despair. They're hopeless. And once they come together and identify with others who are going through like experiences, when they're provided the information and education about grief being a healing process, that they're not crazy, that grief is not meant to destroy them, but it's an opportunity for growth. To see people transform and to receive that information and begin to find hope and have a reason to live is transformative. And that's the greatest reward for me. Equity in healthcare is an ethical issue. To deny a human being the right to health is denying them the right to life. And I think there are medical ethics that create the moral principles for us as health professionals to provide and to be just and to be moral in allowing the right care and making the right decisions for individuals in their health. To be recognized by Judge Alexander Williams Jr. for this award, because he is an individual that stands for health equity, that also recognizes the importance of health equity in marginalized communities and people who are underserved. And that is an honor and my duty and my responsibility as an African American, as a health professional, and it's also my corporate responsibility. And I'm honored to be fulfilling that duty.
Please join me in congratulating one of this year's Ethics Award honorees, Roberta's House, for their tremendous and exceptional work supporting youth and families in Baltimore, Maryland.
I was so excited to give Annette the award. You can see that I kind of changed the order of the program. So I'm glad that you're most forgiving. So thank you so much. Now, I want to introduce a video that tells you a little bit more about what we've been doing at the center. Given the pandemic, our hearts and our implemented work has been focused on what is life like for children, particularly in Baltimore City, who had to manage and help their families manage without the tools that you and I have to get through a day with ease. Our social justice boot camp was designed to empower students, and I think the video speaks powerfully for what that experience was like. So I'd like you to introduce it, and I hope you enjoy it. And the next voice after mine will be the wonderful and professional speaker, Mary. So thank you again. Enjoy.
Those who are disadvantaged and underserved, a lot of times are young people and youth. And going to West Baltimore, which is an area right now that is needed, it's under construction, they're trying to redevelop and move that area. We're going to have some space over in the new Thurgood Marshall Center. And one of our signature programs, of course, is the boot camp program, where we are looking at students in the various high schools. We're going to inform them as to higher education, and of course bring them to the campus here at University of Maryland, where they have a full day of classes and exposure and meeting of professors and other students and so forth. And the idea, of course, is to enrich the students and to certainly enlarge their knowledge and information, and maybe even desire to move on and become very respectable and dedicated young people.
Just say a few things about our center and why it is we do this work and how we came to be. My colleague and I, Marcy Deloach, who you may have met earlier, were at a dedication just last week in honor of a young man like yourselves, First Lieutenant Richard W. Collins III, who was murdered in a hate crime on this campus a few years ago. And while we were there, Lieutenant Collins' family spoke, senators, congresspersons, elected officials spoke, and talked about the importance of this plaza, which you'll get a chance to visit today, actually, as a reminder of how important it is that we reaffirm our values in justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, that reaffirm our humanity. But the inescapable weight of the racist terrorist massacre in Buffalo, which had just happened a day or two before, was looming like a cloud over the event, and it rained that day. And every speaker who spoke about the dedication of that plaza talked about the ongoing need for social justice education, which is what we're going to be doing here today. Talked about the ongoing need for movements to ensure human rights, freedom, equality, justice, the values that many of our elders and ancestors fought and died for. And so it's out of the wake of the aftermath of the tragic murder of Lieutenant Collins that I actually joined the University of Maryland. I came here and I accepted a position here at the WW Center in 2017. And the center itself joined the university in 2016. And so I like to just provide this touchstone for you, because in many ways, Lieutenant Collins' story, unfortunately, is a story of far too many young people. He had just graduated from Bowie State University and was on his way to begin a promising career of military service in the tradition of his father and his grandfather. But his life was stolen. And it's important that we remember that the work we do is inextricably linked to the lives that we value.
Today's event is the Social Justice Boot Camp, where we brought students from Baltimore City schools to learn about how they can make an impact in their community.
It's a new program, a new pilot, where we're engaging youth from Baltimore around social justice education. We've designed and developed a curriculum, and we're engaging students in workshops throughout the day on 5 critical social justice issues: racial injustice, voting rights and civic engagement, climate change and environmental sustainability, epidemic gun violence, public health equity. So my name is Albert Phillips Jr., and I'm a work-based learning specialist with Baltimore City Public Schools. And so I'm in the Office of College and Career Readiness, and we help to be able to facilitate this trip and bringing these students from Baltimore City to be there. At the school that they attend, they get a bad rap. They get a bad reputation. They don't get enough positive press. And so it's good for me to be able to see our students be here because they're learning and growing just like we were when we were their age. And I think it's important for them to have this experience of being on a college campus. They've never been here before, the majority of them. And to be able to talk about these topics in a way that makes them feel comfortable, makes them feel empowered. And they're going to take this back home. They're going to take this back to their community and hopefully be able to spread the information to others.
I'm in this lane because myself, I have families that I've lost to gun violence. I see every day what's going on in my community, and it breaks my heart. So I just want to do all I can to create change in my community.
I'm in this line of work because I've lost countless of people to gun violence, family members, friends. I'm also a gunshot victim survivor myself.
Things that I'm hoping to get out of this, like being able to lower down the gun violence, because it's like it's hurtful to see that people are getting hurt, family members, people's daughters, sons, they're all dying from gun violence, and who wants to go on knowing that you can never see that person again?
I believe that everybody should be treated the same way, the way that everybody should feel, to be completely honest. To treat somebody medically in a way that is unfair to them, it's kind of disgusting, to be honest.
The younger you are and the more you learn while you're younger, the easier it is for change to come.
We want our students not just to be doctors and lawyers or whatever it is they choose to be. We also want them to know that they have a factor to play in helping to change society beyond just like their career or how much money you can make. We want them to know that we need you to come back to your high school at some point, and maybe you take some students on a field trip just like we took y'all on a field trip today. We want y'all to continue to pour into the communities.
The joy I get is seeing the results. When I see the lives being truly changed, it just makes a big difference. But I enjoy working with these kids just to make a difference in their lives.
The satisfaction I get is knowing that there's a strong possibility that there'll be some of the next me. There'll be some of the next people who be combating gun violence. We do understand that gun violence has been here forever, and they'll probably be here until the end of time. But if we have people to follow in our footsteps, they'll be able to continue to carry the torch and do the work.
I think it's important for them, no offense, no shade. I think it's just important for them to see somebody young. I think a lot of the time seeing, these people who are professionals, they're established in their career and everything like that, they're not as easily relatable because, to a 17-year-old, to a 16-year-old, you're like, oh my God, they're how old? They're 40. You saw, in there, they were saying that I was 45 and when they were guessing my age. But I think being able to not just be young, but be able to relate to the place that they're from, because I'm from there too, and say like, hey, like people might look at us a certain way, but here's what I was able to accomplish, and everybody else in this room with you today want to make sure that eventually you get to be the person standing up here talking to Baltimore youth and talking to them about like, hey, this is how you can help your community, and you guys are already on the right track.
Seeing the next generation is really empowering, especially today. There's a lot going on that I myself, who is probably a decade older than a lot of these students, haven't wrapped my head around. And so to see these students try to tackle these issues that are so large and so astronomical is really incredible to me, that there's people out there who have that pursuit and that passion to make a change and make a difference in a world that seems like no matter what you do, there's going to be something that happens that's going to shut you down a bit.
We want to make sure that we're doing our part to foster and facilitate positive growth, particularly among our young people, and make sure that they understand that their presence is needed, their voices are important and needed, and that together we believe that we can write a new narrative for this country and set this country on a new direction, a new trajectory, to create greater equity, a more just society, and more robust opportunities for everyone.
Those of us are certainly to be applauded. At this time, I would like to introduce Judge Sydney Butcher, who will tell us more about our next awardee.
Okay, good evening. Please join me in turning our attention to the screen for a brief video presentation for our next Ethics Award honoree.
Please join me in congratulating the Parole Health Center under the leadership of Ms. Alice Wright, one of this year's Ethics Award honorees. An amazing community-based resource right here in Anne Arundel County that started out as a PTA program and has evolved over the years into a first-class health resource center serving the healthcare needs of local community members right here in Anne Arundel County.
My name is Alice Katrina Wright. I'm a retired registered nurse and the president of the Community Health Center at Parole, Inc. Parole, Inc. manages and owns the Parole Health Center, which is located at 1950 Drew Street in Annapolis, Maryland. The Parole Health Center provides health care services for the residents of Annapolis and Anne Arundel County. The greatest joy that I get is serving the community, no matter who it is in the community, just providing a service for those individuals, knowing that someone is being taken care of, their needs are being met, whether they are financially able to meet those needs or not, just to provide a quality health care of sort for that individual, providing quality health care for the community. People of color are still having problems getting the kind of services and the type of services that they should be getting, and that's available that they should be getting, and they're not really getting it. It's just an honor to be recognized by Judge Williams. We feel so honored to be chosen. We know that we have been in the community for over 86 years, providing the service for the community. We work very hard. We are volunteers. We just work very hard for the community, and we work very hard to maintain that center. And we maintain that center through fundraisers and grants. We're now a historical landmark. And that's something that we're very proud of.
We're so happy to recognize Ms. Alice Wright for her leadership of the Parole Health Center as one of this year's Ethics Award honorees.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in congratulating our 2022 Ethics Award honoree. The Parole Health Center accepting the award on their behalf is the chair of their board, Alice Wright.
Good evening, everyone. What an honor, what a privilege. And I am so humbled, and the Community Health Center at Parole, Inc., they are humbled also. Such an honor. Judge Williams, we thank you. We work hard at the health center, we volunteer, and we offer quality health care services for the community. We're a historic landmark, like I said before, but most of all, we give the love and the care for the residents for Parole, Annapolis, and Anne Arundel County. So to God be the glory for all the great things that we've done and what we will continue to do, providing quality health care for all people, So thank you again. We just appreciate this. And again, I said to God be the glory, and we will continue as long as we can to give the quality health care for all people. Thank you.
Congratulations once again to our honorees. Coming to the stage next is Dr. Dana Williams to highlight our next honoree.
Good evening, and thank you, Miri. It's my pleasure to introduce our third and final video presentation about our final Ethics Award honoree. Please turn with me now as we watch.
Please join me in recognizing the Maryland Center for Health Equity under the leadership of Dr. Stephen Thomas, one of this year's Ethics Award honorees. Dr. Thomas has done an amazing job advancing health equity in local communities here in Maryland and beyond the state.
Hello, my name is Dr. Stephen B. Thomas. I'm a professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the University of Maryland School of Public Health in College Park, where I direct the Maryland Center for Health Equity. And the Maryland Center for Health Equity is focused on translating the science of medicine and public health into culturally tailored, community-based interventions, all focused on accelerating the prevention of chronic disease in African American communities and marginalized communities. I think that this whole effort of advancing health equity is consistent with our theme of civil rights in this country. It's a civil rights issue. It's an ethical issue. It's a moral issue. Because right now, if we've learned anything from the pandemic, is that our hyper-local approach actually works. You have to work and reach people where they are. And we've done that in our center by working through Black barbershops and beauty salons. We call it HAIR, Health Advocates in Reach and Research. And you don't have to tell my white friends, no self-respecting Black barber would ever say, I'll get you in and out in 10 minutes. And it doesn't matter how much hair you have, you're gonna be in there half a day. And so for the past decade, we've been working to bring health services into barbershops and beauty salons. And then the pandemic hit. And that's when we really needed to build those relationships and to transform vaccines into vaccinations. On this campus, sometimes I encounter giants like Judge Alex Williams. He's a giant, and I have a chance to actually be under his wing and be mentored by him in the context of the role he played as a judge. He dealt with those social determinants of health. And so now I can marry the clinical, the individual health with the social determinants, and the judge is opening up new opportunities in the criminal justice area to deal with our youth that have been touched by the criminal justice system and may have felony records, can't get jobs, but to even go further down and start working with the youth and creating boot camps for them to steer them away, just like I'm doing in prevention of chronic diseases. He's mitigating and preventing our young people from ending up in that criminal justice system. I think that's amazing. It's an honor and a pleasure to have an award that's named after the judge.
And once again, please join me in recognizing Dr. Stephen Thomas, Director of the Maryland Center for Health Equity.
Congratulations to our 2022 Ethics Award honoree, the Maryland Center for Health Equity, and accepting the award on behalf of the center is its director, Dr. Stephen Thomas. Congratulations. Judge, are you coming or are we coming down to you? We'll come down.
You know, Marcy said, just get the award, no talk. But I have to say, I told the judge, I said, Judge, I still have a comb. I'm just using it on my face now. My judge still has his hair pick. I'm just so honored to have this award and to recognize the barbers and stylists out there who really bent the curve. We closed the health disparity gap in COVID mortality in Prince George's County because of the work we did. Yes, give all of ourselves a hand here. And I'm honored to have a representative from the Maryland State Medical Society here, Dr. Ritter's here. And tonight, I've got barbers and stylists from across the country on a Zoom tonight being trained in how to help our community address type 2 diabetes. Hey, Judge, let's take this all the way and save our community. Thank you so much.
Well, he had a vision and the determination to bring it all to fruition. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce the founder and executive director of the Judge A.W. Center, Judge Alexander Williams, Jr.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Let me express my appreciation to all for your attendance here on this 4th annual lecture and for your continued support of this annual event. I was a little apprehensive at scheduling this event a couple days after the national election and a day before a national holiday, Veterans Day, tomorrow. But this turnout has allayed my anxiety. Your support of this lecture and of our center is so vital to what we do in the area of social justice and in addressing the development of other policy issues. I want to first give a shout out to the terrific staff of the Judge Alexander Williams Jr. Center for their hard work of planning and putting together this successful annual event, and to the board of directors of this center, and to give them a huge thanks for volunteering their time, and to also thank both the College of Behavior and Social Sciences at College Park and the distinguished faculty and chair of the Department of African American Studies. I also wish to congratulate this year's awardees, the Roberta's House, located in Baltimore, the Maryland Center for Health Equity, located here at the University of Maryland School of Public Health, and the Parole Health Center, located in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, for their outstanding work that they each do for citizens and for the community with respect to our theme this year, health access, health disparities, and health equity. We have an exciting lecturer today, and I'm going to present him in a couple of minutes. But preliminarily, let me go back a year and remind us of last year's dynamic lecture addressing criminal justice reform, and specifically lifting up the issue of the plight of the innocent and others serving unjust sentences, and the success of releasing individuals who were innocent and serving sentences. Our outstanding presenter last year was Professor Erica Suter, the director of the Innocent Project at the University of Baltimore Law School and the coordinator of the law school's partnership with the Maryland Office of the Public Defender. Many here, I suspect, may have followed the news of Anand Syed, who was convicted in 1999 and sentenced in 2000 to life in prison plus 30 years for the death of, I think her name is Mim Lee. Well, Mr. Syed always maintained his innocence, and just this past month, due largely to the legal services provided on his behalf by his attorney, Professor Suter, the prosecutors who said they lost faith in the conviction proceeded to drop all charges after a judge vacated the conviction, accepting Professor Suter's argument as to the unreliability of the cell tower records and the failure of prosecutors to turn over relevant and undisclosed evidence implicating two other potential suspects. Just this past week, some of us here in this room were privileged to be present at the 50th year celebration of the Maryland Office of the Public Defender, and we observed Erica Suter on behalf of the University of Baltimore School of Law accept the award for the Innocent Project on the 50th anniversary. Well, Professor Suter was scheduled to be here and join with us today, but she couldn't. She is recently getting over a positive test of COVID, so she won't be here with us, but I wanted to recognize her and what she's been doing in the community. Now, this year's theme for the Judge A.W. Center focuses on health. So many of us have taken the blessing of a reasonable portion of health somewhat for granted. I certainly have. In my role as a director of both the University of Maryland Medical System Board and as chair of the University Capital Region Health Hospital Board, I have come to really appreciate the importance of access to health and the health challenges and health disparities which exist in this country and in our state. I'm very sensitive to that now because of my role. Our speaker this year hardly needs any introduction. Dr. Joseph Wright is a nationally known and a Maryland and locally based physician with a specialty in pediatrics. He has served as senior vice president within the Children's National Health System and has taught as a professor in over 30 institutions and entities, including an adjunct professor of emergency medicine and health policy at George Washington University, teaching health policy management at the University of Maryland School of Public Health, serving 17 years as the inaugural state pediatric medical director within the Maryland Institute for Emergency Medical Services, and he served as a tenured professor and chair of pediatrics at the Howard University College of Medicine, just to name a sprinkling of his impressive background. Dr. Wright is the immediate past chair of the American Academy of Pediatrics Committee on Pediatric Emergency Medicine, and he chaired the Academy's task force on addressing bias and discrimination. But more importantly for us here in Maryland, Dr. Wright, who is and has been well known, revered, and respected for his leadership as the medical director at the University of Maryland Capital Region Health Hospital, but he now is the inaugural Chief Equity Officer of the 12 campus, 30,000 employee University of Maryland Medical System, commonly referred to as UMS, where he oversees, develops, and directs policies addressing challenging issues of health equity, health access, and health disparities. I could say so much more on the work and experience of our speaker, but without further ado, I am delighted to welcome and present as our orator for the evening, Dr. Joseph L. Wright, the Chief Health Equity Officer for the University of Maryland Medical System. let us warmly receive Dr. Joseph Wright.
Thank you, Judge. And I wanted to get up here quickly because I know that we have a tight program. I'm going to set my alarm, so I want to be respectful of your time this evening. But I can't tell you how honored I am to be a part of this evening's program. Judge Williams has been a mentor and a hero to so many of us in Prince George's County and across the state. And when he asked me to do this, I didn't hesitate 1 second. And I am delighted this evening to share his passion for health equity and take just a few moments to share some knowledge. Now, I am a hopeless academic, so you all will have to bear with me as I move through a PowerPoint deck, but I promise you I'll move quickly. Okay, so let's get going. So I have nothing to disclose, and and the context for my perspective, though, as the judge said, I am a pediatrician, and so my job has been working in emergency departments in several cities over the course of the past 30 years, and I have enjoyed an avocation for child health advocacy, and my scholarly work has been largely in emergency medical services for children and pre-hospital pediatrics. But now, my passion, which has been as the young folks say, my side hustle throughout my career, but is now part of what is the expectation for my job, is to focus on equity science, and also a passion is to develop the next generation, because this work is necessarily generational and transformative. What I'm going to be talking about tonight may not impact us directly, it may not even impact our children directly, but assuredly, we will impact the generations of young people to come, and I will speak about that. In terms of the context of my remarks, the judge mentioned that I am a sitting board member of the American Academy of Pediatrics, so you will see that flavor throughout the talk. And let's just start with some contemporary definitions of equity and health equity, and I'll just have you focus here on what's highlighted. Because in order to achieve health equity, we must assuredly change the systems and policies that have resulted in generational injustices and that give rise to racial and ethnic health disparities. And these definitions are action-oriented. All too often, some of the earlier descriptions of the work to be done have been deficit language that has not really spoken to what has to be done. So I just wanted to share that with you as we get started. And again, as I mentioned, we have to look at this work through the lens of the life course perspective. Well, what do I mean? Again, a self-respecting pediatrician here, you're gonna hear this life course perspective throughout the talk, because assuredly what happens to our young people is what is going to drive the society. And in terms of policy, in terms of the exposures and what we need to do to support our young people is a very big part of this work. So tonight I'm going to organize my remarks around the tenets of truth, reconciliation, and transformation, which was the outline for a statement that we authored at the American Academy of Pediatrics following the murder of George Floyd in the summer of 2020. I will lay out how we got here, why this is important, and what lies ahead. But before we dive in, please indulge me as I read this important level set, and I do this for all of these talks that I give because it's important to understand the task at hand. The work of advancing equity and anti-racism is necessarily iterative and incremental. It requires commitment, courage, humility, introspection, and resolve. This is uncharted territory, and moving forward can feel challenging, disruptive, frustrating, and polarizing. We can't expect to immediately have all the answers. We're at unique places on our individual journeys and must embrace the opportunity to learn from our collective fits and starts. So this is a long and winding road. We can't be certain what's around the next bend, but for sure, this work is about perspective transformation, changing hearts and minds. If you know, think, and believe differently, you will decide, act, and do differently. To catalyze perspective transformation, we must engage both the head and the heart. One approach alone cannot change an organization or a culture, much less an individual. So when it comes to the work of equity and anti-racism, we must not only be driven by the moral imperative, as Dr. Thomas mentioned, but we must commit to being factual and evidence-informed. So we'll start with some basic truths and debunk some widely held assumptions. It's going to be a little science here. Flawed assumption: race is a biologic category. Flawed assumption: race is a construct for genetic difference. Flawed assumption that there is an equivalency between the genes that determine race and the genes that determine health. Race is not a biologic category based on innate differences. Rather, it is a social construct that reflects differential and often inequitable lived experiences and should not be used as a biologic proxy for disparities. And we learned from the Human Genome Project that we are far more alike than different, and that the greatest fraction of genetic diversity is actually found within populations rather than between them. So more like the image on the right than the popularly held conception depicted on the left. So bottom line here, we share 99.9% of DNA with one another. Only 0.1% varies between individuals. Yet stratification based on the minute portion of that 0.1% variation responsible for the phenotype of skin color has been used throughout history to justify a belief in human hierarchy. So those truths notwithstanding, race has been inappropriately used as a corrective, risk-adjusting, or dichotomizing variable in algorithms, practice guidelines, or policies that influence the clinical decision-making process. Structural and systemic inequities that produce disparate outcomes are broadly rampant in society, and the profession of medicine is no exception. Unwinding race-based medicine is a tall task and a heavy lift. And I know it's cliche, but certainly applicable here. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with but a single step. So let me share with you an example of a race-based approach to clinical care delivery, one that has been a part of my practice throughout my career. So urinary tract infection, for those of you who are parents, you may have taken your child to the physician for the workup of a urinary tract infection. And you can see in the clinical practice guideline algorithm on the left-hand side of this slide that in the accompanying calculator on the right-hand side of this slide, that race assignment is used as a dichotomizing variable to determine the course of care. In this case, whether to obtain a catheterized urine specimen. Now, I personally know the researchers who performed the foundational work that led to the development of this algorithm and the calculator well. They are my colleagues, and they didn't wake up one day with the intent to discriminate against little black girls. However, in interpreting their data, they inappropriately inserted race as a default biologic proxy. in lieu of an incompletely explained epidemiologic observation that they made. Detailed examination of the data and the literature upon which they made their premise reveals nothing that specifically aligns this risk of a urinary tract infection with subjective racial identification. So in this case, the just approach is to confer equitable care to all children regardless of race. More to come on that. The University of Maryland medical system just recently removed the race variable that has been used for decades to stage chronic kidney disease. And we are now among a number of systems across the country that are leveling the playing field for African Americans with chronic kidney disease. And this is work that is ongoing. There are many, many, many opportunities that we have in the field of medicine to make these kinds of corrections. But let me just talk for a moment in terms of how we got here. This is a question that I get most often. And I'll share one historical transgression having to do with pulmonary medicine. The roots of race-based lung function assessment can be traced back to founding father Thomas Jefferson, considered an enlightened intellectual of the era. Jefferson wrote in his influential 1781 treatise, Notes on the State of Virginia, about differences in lung capacity between the enslaved and white colonists. He remarked on the dysfunction of the pulmonary apparatus in blacks and that, quote, among the real distinctions which nature has made is a lack of lung capacity. Now, completely speculative yet widely accepted, Jefferson's assertion remained empirically unchallenged until the second half of the 19th century, when Louisiana physician Samuel Cartwright, drawing directly from Jefferson's unfounded hypothesis, performed rudimentary experiments using the enslaved on his plantation as unconsented subjects. Cartwright concluded and published that lung capacity in the Negro was 20% deficient, and went on to further theorize that because small lungs prevent blacks from inhaling enough air that, quote, forced labor is a way to vitalize the blood and correct the problem. This pseudoscience served to reinforce the practice of slavery and to perversely justify its necessity. And despite growing acceptance of the false equivalency of race as a biologic proxy, there persist numerous examples of attempted race correction or adjustment that have manifest in differential approaches to disease management and produce adverse clinical outcomes. This is just but one of many of the roots of race-based guidelines that are often rooted in historically racialized and unsubstantiated science. So creating a level playing field for the equitable delivery of care is certainly an answer to the question of why this is important. But there are other domains in which this work needs to be carried out, not the least of which is the demography of this nation. For the population under the age of 18, back in 2018, 4 years ago, that population became more children of color than other, and for the entire population, it's projected by the census that by 2043, that will be the case for the entirety of the population. And here in the state of Maryland, we are already one of 8 states that is already quote unquote majority minority. So when we just look at, and this is where I'm going to emphasize the importance of focusing on children, when we look at the impact of stress, for instance, and we talk about the impact of toxic stress, which is prolonged activation of stress responses in the absence of protected relationships. That's a bad thing. Generally, for most of us, stress is a positive thing. It allows us to exercise our fight or flight response and make decisions based on response to stress. But when that stress is toxic, it has profound biologic effects, and the cortisol response to toxic stress bathes our organs. That blue line up top is what a prolonged stress response looks like.
And in terms of the impact on our organs, the brain is probably the most important impacted area by toxic stress. And you can see here some of the important functions: executive functioning, thoughts, emotions, actions, short-term memory, emotional reaction to fear. And so these are just some examples of why we need to understand the impact of toxic stress. Now, why do I perseverate on this issue of toxic stress? Because folks don't wake up in the 4th and 5th decade of life with chronic disease. The antecedent seeds that produce health disparities are sown in childhood, fueled by environmental and social stressors, and are manifest through several physiologic mechanisms that include but aren't limited to chronic inflammation, altered immunity, and something we call allostatic loading. And the effects of these physiologic and allostatic loading processes have been described as weathering. And for African American men, telomere length, the little arm on our chromosomes, has been posited as a biomarker for the effects of discrimination as a result of weathering. So we all bring our experiences to the table. So this image, of course, April 4th, 1968, the balcony on the Lorraine Motel is burned into my memory. I know exactly where I was, exactly where every member of my family was when Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated on this balcony at the Lorraine in Memphis. But I also remember, and this is that my adolescent self, the first time that I was exposed to explicit bias, the first time I was called the N-word as I became a student at a new school where I was just one of 4 students of color. The microaggressions and the internalization to survive being in that environment, and then the re-traumatization of seeing these guys every day. That adds up to allostatic load, and not to mention also a few years later, my family experiencing the murder of the shooting death of an uncle at the hands of white police officers. He himself, a patrolman who was mistaken for a criminal, and my cousins on the front page of the New York Times. These experiences are part of my personal journey and who I am, and I worry about the length of my telomeres based on these experiences and those of my sons. But it's important to understand that the environmental and social stressors not only can influence the memories and the biology, but also our very DNA and the incorporation of what are known as epigenetic factors. Now, epigenetics wasn't a thing when I was coming through school. There may be people in this room a little younger who have been exposed in school to this concept of environmental factors that actually change the very cellular makeup of who we are. And so epigenetic factors are incorporated at the chromosomal level. And we're beginning to fully understand the underlying biology of how chronic stress impacts that. So for instance, the biologic effects of historically mediated trauma may linger even in individuals who have seemingly escaped the more toxic environments to which their ancestors were exposed. Linking this basic science knowledge with the evolving work of defining the deleterious impacts of racism is critically important. And bear with me here as I just share with you this experiment, this seminal experiment, where stress-induced epigenetic effects were demonstrated to be transmitted intergenerationally, even when the stress-producing stimulus is no longer present. So what this is a mouse model, and the stress-inducing stimulus was preceded by a specific odor. And so in the F1 generation, the offspring of the stressed mice that had not been exposed to the stressor, these mice demonstrated the same fear in response to the stimulus as their parents did. The brains of that subsequent generation demonstrated significant aberrations in organization, as well as altered DNA of relevant genes. Further, the next generation, the F2 generation of these mice showed similar anatomic, behavioral, and epigenetic changes. In summary, this basic science study is illustrative of the degree to which we are understanding the underlying biology of chronic stress, including that which accompanies racism and social marginalization. So bottom line, racism is toxic to children, and for the work that I do with my colleagues in academic medicine, it's important that we know this and we understand this, because in the words of El-Haj Malik, we cannot teach what we do not know or lead where we are not willing to go. So why else is this important? From a policy perspective, can't come to the Judge Williams Center and not talk about policy, right? The accreditation and regulatory environment is rife with health equity emphasis in virtually all aspects of administration. And I know we have at least one hospital CEO, medical system CEO here in the room, where the Joint Commission comes through the door to accredit your facility, and they want to know how you're addressing health equity. What are the standards by which you are addressing this challenge? CMS, with regard to payment, has launched in its Innovation Center a new initiative to advance health equity, and something that, as part of their rulemaking, will become a responsibility for all of us in healthcare systems starting next year. The U.S. News and World Report, which is more of a reputational survey, has already, through 2 cycles, begun to address health equity as part of its methodology. And for those who are in teaching institutions, it is the expectation that the next generation of learners will receive training and experience as part of their quality improvement education in addressing health disparities. So anywhere you look in healthcare, this is a critically important and evolving issue. And in terms of organized medicine, the world of medical societies, the need to unwind those race-based algorithms I talked about a moment ago and eliminate race-based medicine is also taking hold and gaining a lot of traction. And lest we think the public is not watching, the release of that eliminating race-based medicine policy statement that I just showed you generated a great deal of media attention, despite the fact that it was a very crowded news cycle in that first week of May. That was the week that Elon Musk first announced that he was going to purchase Twitter. That story has had a lot of legs, but this work has had a lot of legs too, and there's a lot of eyes on what we in the healthcare industry are doing. So what is the task at hand? And I show you, this is a 200-page manual that sits on my shelf of all of the practice guidelines and policies that drive care, pediatric care, published by the American Academy of Pediatrics. This book has to be scrubbed with an equity lens. And that's going to take time. I always remind my colleagues, we didn't get here overnight, and we're not going to fix it overnight, but we got to get started. So we understand that in order to move towards equity and anti-racism, we need to appreciate the biology of adversity, and that it is a complex milieu anchored by systemic and structural inequities that play out over the life course and can be transmitted intergenerationally, as I've demonstrated through some of the basic science work. So therefore, the task in organized medicine is to recognize racism in all its forms, call it explicitly by name, declaratively oppose it, and most importantly, exercise commitment and resolve to actively replace it. More specifically, we must move from race-based to race-conscious medicine. Now, what do I mean by that? Race-conscious medicine decenters race and identifies racism as a possible primary driver of disparities. This is one of those perspective transformation moments. Think racism, not race. This is a pivotal concept. Determination of care delivery based on capricious, subjective stratification as judged by the phenotypic physical characteristic of skin color is fraught with uncertainty. While we must surely be cognizant of the significance of assigned race along the causal pathways of disease, we cannot independently substitute race alone as a proxy for underlying biologic mechanisms. We must therefore be conscious of the role that race plays as a driver of systemic inequities and disparate outcomes, especially as it relates to the influence of the social determinants of health. Imagine getting 3/4 of the way through this talk and I haven't even talked about the social determinants of health. Well, I'm going to talk about it now. But let me first interject Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson in her comments relative to the, they call it redistricting, I call it gerrymandering, but in her comments relative to the argument from the state of Alabama about the way in which they redistricted their voting districts, talked about how the framers themselves adopted the Equal Protection Clause in a race-conscious way. And now this was considered an originalist approach. And there are judges and lawyers in this room, so I'm not going to even posit what an originalist approach means, but it just reminds me when I see this that of a Zimbabwean proverb. Until the lion tells the story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. So I appreciate Judge Brown Jackson's originalist remarks about race consciousness. I think we're in good company here. So let's revisit our friends with that pediatric UTI algorithm that I showed you earlier. This is the article that was published back in June, Another Perspective Transformation Moment, an introduction of this concept of race-conscious medicine in a very high-profile journal, the Journal of the American Medical Association, where these authors wrote, race-conscious medicine encourages interrogating how race is likely to be a proxy for other factors, and that those factors should be considered for inclusion in the clinical decision-making process. So that in the world of academic medicine, that's a huge step forward. And revisiting our friends again with this pediatric UTI issue, they have come back to the drawing board, went back into the lab, and removed the race variable from the calculator and replaced it with two more appropriate variables, clinical variables, a history of urinary tract infection and duration of fever, and demonstrated that the accuracy of the tool was equivalent to the previous model in which race was included. So they have demonstrated, and you might ask the question, well, why were these other two variables not there in the first place? That's the subject of another lecture. But this is an important step forward for our field. The fact that we are now going back to our research community to saying you've got to pull back the covers and look at what you're doing. And I often use the term, we cannot apply lazy science here. We cannot lob in race as a biologic proxy inappropriately. So moving forward, and I know this is a terrible analogy for a pediatrician to say here, but it drills the message home. So again, indulge me as I read these words verbatim, because they represent the most common source of angst and confusion to which I've been responding regularly. So even in the face of insurmountable evidence that race is not a biologic proxy, there is definitely a role for what race represents in terms of differential lived experiences and exposures. And we must rigorously incorporate those socially determined factors that frame health status into clinical practice guidelines and to necessarily eliminate disparities and achieve more equitable outcomes. So this is the bottom line here. What we do in the office, for instance, in clinical care, is but a small part. So fixing those algorithms, we got to do it, but it's just a small part of the contributors to health outcomes. And I just want to show you a couple of examples here as I get to the end. when you think about the differences, and this is a statement on drowning prevention and the fact that children of color have higher rates of drowning than other children. And I was encouraged by this language because this also represents a step forward in terms of how we frame our output, our product, our articles, with no physiologic differences to explain the difference in drowning risk. Race and ethnicity are likely a proxy for social and cultural differences. Understanding reasons are not well understood, but may include historical factors such as segregation, lack of access, and environmental influences. And this was chronicled in the New York Times piece this summer, where it talked about the fact that the enslaved were not permitted to learn how to swim because of fear of the risk of escape. And here in this article is focused on the Nile Swim Club. Any Philadelphians here in the room? Yeah, okay. So the fact that access to pools and swim clubs, it was largely segregated, and that our children have not had similar access. So just the fact that this represents an advance, just the acknowledgement of these kinds of influences is important. This is I trained at Children's, as the judge said, I trained at Children's National Hospital in District of Columbia, and it's in the Bloomingdale, Eckington community in Middle Washington, D.C. And this is a copy of a restrictive covenant for homes in that neighborhood from obviously some years ago. But when we think about redlining and the impact of discriminatory housing practices, and for those of you, particularly those who are Baltimore-based, have not had a chance to take a look at this book by Richard Rothstein, The Color of Law, which describes Baltimore as sort of the epicenter of redlining, if you weren't aware. It's important to understand these historical factors because in terms of housing, restrictive covenants and redlining's residual echo have impacted environmental justice or injustice. And when we think about one of the challenges that my colleague Dr. King and I are focused on in the state of Maryland is asthma, specifically pediatric asthma. Yet when we look at those disparities, do we even account for where people live and what they are exposed to? No. So we have to be much more cognizant of these socially determined factors as they impact health outcomes, and also be aware of from whence they've come. And if you missed this story, go back and read this. This is from August, also featured in the New York Times. So Nathan Connolly and Shani Mott are professors at Johns Hopkins. Nathan Connolly is the chair of history at Johns Hopkins. And in fact, Nathan Connolly is a national expert on redlining. Yet, when they went to refinance their home, it was appraised at $300,000 less than what it should have. So they whitewashed their home. They took out all vestiges of who they are and had a colleague stand in for them at the reappraisal. And the feature of this story that hit me hardest was that they have 3 children at home. And here's a quote: "We had to have a conversation with our kids about why we're pulling down their drawings," Dr. Connolly said. "It's very humiliating to strip yourself of your own home." This community, I think this is a community in North Baltimore. If we think that housing discrimination went away 30 years ago with the end of redlining, this is happening every day. So let me just hot off speaking of headlines, so this Politico article was published a week ago in response to an FDA hearing on the use of pulse oximeters and the fact that they perform worse in people with darker skin. Well, on the left-hand side of this image is why. Because the infrared light, does everyone know what I'm talking about when I say pulse oximeter? Some of you probably got one on your wrist right now. Those wearables, everybody got a wearable that, yeah, look at it. Yeah, I knew you'd have one. So guess what, folks? The very technology, and by the way, pulse oximeters have been around for 25 years throughout the entirety of my career, and they are ubiquitous in every hospital, office, emergency department. This is a standard tool. Yet, the fact that the bias that is literally built into the technology, where the presence of melanin distracts the ability of those infrared wavelengths to penetrate to actually detect the oxygenation in the blood. And so what's the impact of that? Okay, you say, okay, what does that mean? Well, in the after-action analyses of coming out of the pandemic, it was noted that patients of color were 3 times more likely to not be offered supplemental oxygen based on the pulse oximetry reading, when in fact, when they had actual hypoxemia, occult hypoxemia that was not detected by the pulse oximeter. And the fact that the device industry has the solution. The device industry, it has to do it. I'm not a biomedical engineer, but this is a pretty straightforward problem. It's not like unwinding some of those race-based algorithms I spoke to you earlier. This requires a technological solution to obviate the presence of melanin with the infrared light that is transmitted through the skin to detect oxygenation. And so, again, this is another area of challenge. There are other devices. This technology is actually used in those thermometers, infrared thermometers, right? And also, again, in my field, if you've ever had a child with jaundice, a newborn who's got yellow, they use a transcutaneous mechanism to detect the level of bilirubin, also same technology. So we've got a lot of work to do, folks, a lot of challenges here. And we have to apply scientific integrity. We really have to be very deliberate, and we have to, just like those investigators who went back to the drawing board and took a look at their own work. By the way, they were very reluctant when we first approached them to take down that calculator, that algorithm, which lives, you know, these days, the medical students and residents, everything's on, is here, right? So they have, they go on and say pediatric urinary tract infection, boom, it comes up. So they were reluctant to take down that calculator, and I'm just, again, encouraged that they did go back and reanalyze their own work. We have to be collaborative and comprehensive in the way that we approach this, and the advent of what we're calling convergent science, which is not always the case in academic medicine. We can sometimes get a little siloed, and we don't include the social scientists, we don't include the economists, we don't include the legal community when we think about these problems. We must be much more comprehensive and collaborative. And we must support what I heard at the FDA hearing is inclusive science. And we must support those young people, those investigators, so they are not faced with this kind of challenge. And I am happy to report that and this is very appropriate here talking about the University System of Maryland in honor of the immediate past president of University of Maryland, Baltimore County, Freeman Roboski. The Howard Hughes Medical Institute has partnered to offer a lot of money for scholars who are focused on diverse, inclusive science. And these are people like Kizzy Corbett. Kizzy Corbett, of course, is one of the investigators who worked with Dr. Fauci and his team to develop the COVID vaccine. Kizzy is a graduate of UMBC and also a social scientist as well as as an immunologist. And Kizzy, Harvard stole her away. Oops. Sorry. Harvard, that's my alarm. That means I'm almost there, folks. but it is encouraging. It is encouraging to see the Howard Hughes Medical Institute committing these kinds of resources to develop the next generation. And I'll just end going back to our long and winding road. It's important in terms of strategy and tactics to skew to the evidence. We have to appeal to the inherent lifelong learner in all of us, as I hope I've done a little bit with you tonight, to build our fund of knowledge. And we must develop awareness of surreptitiously hidden history. You know, digging out that history around race norming and lung function assessment, you know, that was not widely appreciated. And so we must expand our knowledge. And then we just also have to emphasize the value of lived experience and leverage our collegial relationships across disciplines to better understand the synergy that is possible. And so I'm going to end with my own differential lived experience moment. I'm a bit of an astronomy buff, and in the pre-dawn of this past June 19th, I arose to view the rare 5-planet celestial alignment from this beach on Hilton Head Island, South Carolina, which historically is the site of escape in 1861 of the nation's first liberated Africans, my direct ancestors among them. Viewing the alignment, especially with the naked eye, was truly amazing and awe-inspiring. I learned that the last time this particular in-sequence planetary alignment had occurred was in March of 1864. So as I stood there, I couldn't help but imagine that very same sky, looking down on my great-great-grandparents, albeit obviously under wholly different circumstances for them. Though liberated behind Union Army lines as a result of the occupation of the Sea Islands, they were still referred to as contraband. The next celestial alignment will occur in August of 2040, when, by the way, as I mentioned, the United States will demographically be predominantly a population of color. Dr. King reminded us that the arc of the moral universe is long, but bends towards justice. It is my hope and prayer that the circumstances upon which that sky in 2040 looks down upon us will be wholly different yet again. Thank you.
Can I get a picture of the doctor? All right. Let's give Dr. Wright another hand for lifting up some very, very powerful and very interesting issues, and we're very excited to have him at the University of Maryland Medical System as our Chief Health Equity Officer, because he is enlightening a number of the doctors and staff about this very, very important issue of health equity and disparities and trappings of racism. So, Dr. Wright, thank you so much for joining with us on this important issue. I know it's going to be with us for many years after this. Let me, first of all, thank our MC, Mary Marshall, for being with us again. She did a wonderful job. We have also some board of directors here. If you all can stand, all of them not here, but we have directors. Thank you for what you are doing. And we're right at the end of the session. I always tell my staff that I want to be out of here 8 or shortly after 8. And we've done this. So let me again thank all of you for coming to this 4th annual lecture. And have a good, safe drive home, and hope next year you'll be able to join us in our 5th annual lecture. Good evening, and thank you so much.